Imagine waking up in the year 1700, the floor is cold, the fire's gone out, you stretch, yawn, and reach for your shoes. They're stiff, they're leather, and they don't care which foot you put them on because they were made straight, like little boats. No curve, no arch, no left or right, just a vague idea of foot carved into something that vaguely resembled footwear. Shoemakers didn't bother with left and right. Why? Because it was easier and cheaper. And frankly, no one expected comfort. Shoes were tools, not hugs for your feet. They were meant to protect you from mud, manure, and the occasional rogue nail, not to cradle your toes in ergonomic bliss. For thousands of years, humanity walked in shoes that didn't care. Your feet had to do the adapting. They bent, they blistered, they suffered, and the shoes they just watched, silently, symmetrically. Tonight, we're going to walk through that history slowly, sleepily, from ancient sandals to more stuffed boots, from military marches to Victorian fashion, until finally, someone looked at a foot and said, "Wait a minute, these things are shaped differently." This is the boring history of left and right shoes, and it begins with a very uncomfortable step. Chapter 1. Ancient footwear, sandals, soles, and symmetry. Long before shoelaces, sneakers, or orthopedic insoles, there were sandals, flat, simple, unapologetically symmetrical. In ancient Egypt, shoes were optional. The Nile's soft banks, the warm stone floors, barefoot was the default. But when shoes were worn, they were little more than flat leather soles tied with straps. Left foot, right foot, didn't matter. The design was identical. Function over form, protection over precision. The Greeks followed suit. Their sandals were elegant, yes, but still symmetrical, crafted from leather, tied with cords, and worn interchangeably. Even the mighty philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they all walked in shoes that didn't know left from right, which is oddly poetic considering how much they pondered duality. The Romans, ever practical, introduced sturdier footwear, caligae military sandals with thick soles and hobnails. They were durable, they were loud, they were intimidating, but they were still symmetrical. A Roman soldier could grab any boot and march. No need to sort left from right. Efficiency was king. Across the world, similar patterns emerged. In ancient China, cloth shoes were soft and interchangeable. In India, padukas wooden sandals with a toe knob were worn without concern for foot orientation. In Africa, woven sandals and leather moccasins followed the same rule. One shape fits all. It wasn't laziness, it was tradition. Shoes were tools. They protected the foot from heat, cold, thorns, and stones. Comfort was secondary. Symmetry was simpler. And so, for thousands of years, humanity walked in shoes that didn't care. Your left foot might protest. Your right foot might rebel. But the shoe, it remained blissfully indifferent. Chapter 2. Roman boots and medieval missteps. Let's linger a little longer in Rome. The empire was vast. The roads were straight, and the boots still symmetrical. Roman soldiers wore caligae thick-soled sandals with open toes and iron hobnails hammered into the bottom. They clanked with every step. A marching army sounded like 1,000 angry blacksmiths. But despite their military precision, these boots didn't care which foot they were on. Left foot, right foot, same shape, same pain. The logic was simple. Uniformity meant speed. A soldier could grab any boot from the pile and be ready to march. No sorting, no fitting. Just strap it on and go. And if it didn't fit, well, your foot would learn. The Romans were practical, but not particularly gentle. Their boots were made to last, not to comfort. Leather was soaked, stretched, and nailed into shape. Breaking them in was a rite of passage. Blisters were badges of honor. But caligae weren't just footwear, they were symbols. A Roman soldier's boots marked his status, his readiness, his place in the machine of empire. And when a soldier was dishonorably discharged, his boots were taken away. Literally, he was booted out, one of history's earliest examples of footwear-based humiliation. Outside the military, Roman citizens wore softer shoes. Solea simple sandals for indoor use, calce closed shoes for formal occasions. But again, no left or right, just a pair of symmetrical leather shells, stitched with care and indifference. After Rome fell, Europe stumbled into the medieval period, and with it came a new kind of shoe, the turn shoe. Turn shoes were made inside out. Yes, really. Cobblers stitched the leather wrong side out, then flipped it like a pancake. It created a smoother seam, less rubbing, fewer blisters, but the shape, still symmetrical. Medieval shoes were narrow, flat, and often pointed. The longer the toe, the higher your status. Some nobles wore shoes with tips so long they had to be tied to their knees. Fashion over function, always. And still, no left or right. Shoes were made in pairs, identical twins. You could swap them midday and barely notice except for the smell. The materials varied. Leather, felt, even velvet for the wealthy, but the shape remained stubbornly straight. There were no foot molds, no ergonomic studies, just a cobbler's best guess and a prayer that your feet would forgive you. In castles and cottages alike, people stuffed their shoes with wool, straw, or moss. It was the medieval version of cushioning, and it worked, sort of, until the moss got damp, or the straw poked through, or the wool started to smell like a sheep that had given up, but comfort wasn't the goal. Shoes were status. Protection, a barrier between you and the mud. Let's pause for a moment in a medieval village. It's early morning. The cobbler's shop smells of leather, smoke, and something vaguely goat-like. A young apprentice is stitching a pair of turn shoes, humming a tune that's been passed down for generations. He doesn't measure the customer's feet. He doesn't ask which one is bigger. He just makes two shoes. Same shape, same size, same destiny. The customer arrives, a farmer with calloused hands and mismatched socks. He tries on the shoes. They pinch, they rub, but he smiles politely, because shoes are expensive, and complaining won't make them softer. He'll wear them anyway, to the fields, to the market, to church, and eventually they'll mold to his feet, or his feet will mold to them. Meanwhile, in the manor house, up the hill, a noblewoman selects her shoes from a velvet-lined chest. They're embroidered, they're perfumed, they're pointed like daggers. She wears them to dinner, where she sits for hours and never walks more than 10 steps. Her shoes are symmetrical too, but they're not meant for walking. They're meant for being admired. In medieval times, shoes were rarely thrown away. They were patched, stitched, and handed down. Children wore their parents' shoes. Servants wore their masters' cast-offs, and cobblers became experts in repair, not redesign. There were no shoe stores, no brands, no sizing charts. Just a local craftsman, a pile of leather, and a vague understanding of anatomy, and still no left or right. Even in royal courts where fashion reigned supreme, shoes remained symmetrical. Kings wore them, queens wore them, jesters danced in them, and no one questioned it because that's how it had always been. It's strange, isn't it, to think that for most of human history, we walked in shoes that didn't fit. Not really, not properly. We accepted discomfort as part of life. We limped, we blistered, we stuffed our shoes with herbs and cloth, and hope, and the shoes, they just watched, silent, symmetrical, unmoved by our suffering. But change was coming slowly, quietly. In workshops and barracks and drawing rooms, people began to wonder, what if shoes could be shaped like feet, not just vaguely, but precisely? What if the left foot had its own shoe, and the right foot its own destiny? Chapter 3. The cobbler's craft, handmade but not foot-specific. Step into a cobbler's shop. It's the year 1600. The room is dim. The air smells of leather, beeswax, and something faintly medieval, possibly stew. A wooden bench sits near the hearth. Tools are scattered across it. Awls, knives, curved needles, and blocks of wood. A pair of shoes rests nearby. They're new, they're stiff, and they're perfectly symmetrical. The cobbler wipes his hands on his apron. He's been making shoes for 30 years. He knows every stitch, every seam, every shortcut. But he's never made a left shoe, or a right one, because in his world, shoes are just shoes. Two pieces of leather, stitched and shaped to resemble a foot vaguely. He doesn't measure arches. He doesn't study gait. He doesn't ask which foot is dominant. He just makes a pair, identical twins, ready to be worn, broken in, and eventually tolerated. The art of the turn shoe. Most shoes in pre-industrial Europe were turn shoes. They were stitched inside out, then flipped like a pancake made of cowhide. This technique hid the seams, reduced friction, and gave the shoe a cleaner look. But it didn't improve the fit. Turn shoes were soft, flexible, and symmetrical. They were made from a single piece of leather, folded and stitched. The sole was thin, the upper was plain, and the shape flat, straight, unapologetically indifferent. Cobblers used wooden lasts, foot-shaped blocks, to shape the shoes. But these lasts weren't customized. They weren't labeled left or right. They were generic, one size fits most, and if your feet didn't agree, well, they'd learn. Tools of the trade. The cobbler's toolkit was simple but effective. For punching holes, last; for shaping shoes, needle and thread; for stitching, seams, knife; for trimming, leather, pitch and wax; for waterproofing. There were no machines, no conveyor belts, just hands, patience, and a lifetime of practice. Shoemaking was slow. A single pair could take days, and every stitch was done by candlelight, with fingers calloused from years of work. But despite the craftsmanship, the design remained stubbornly symmetrical, because that's how it had always been, and no one questioned it. The fit was negotiable. When a customer came in, the cobbler didn't take measurements. He looked at the feet, eyeballed them, maybe traced them on parchment if he was feeling fancy. Then he made the shoes, two identical shapes, and hoped for the best. If the shoes pinched, stuff them with wool. If they slipped, add a strap. If they blistered, break them in. Shoes weren't expected to fit perfectly. They were expected to last, to survive mud, rain, and cobblestone streets. Comfort was a luxury. Durability was the goal. Socks, stuffing, and survival to make shoes bearable. People got creative. They wore thick woolen socks. They stuffed shoes with straw, moss, or cloth. They lined them with fur in winter, and in summer, they simply endured. Some even soaked their shoes in water, then wore them until they dried, forcing the leather to mold to their feet. It worked sort of, but it also led to soggy socks and a smell that could clear a room. Still, people adapted because shoes were expensive, and once you had a pair, you made them work. Class and craftsmanship in wealthy households. Shoes were fancier, made from velvet, silk, or embroidered leather. decorated with pearls, ribbons, and gold thread, but still symmetrical. Nobles didn't walk much. Their shoes were for show, for banquets, balls, and brief strolls through manicured gardens. Comfort wasn't expected. Elegance was everything. In contrast, peasants wore shoes made from rough leather or felt. They were patched, stitched, and passed down. A father's shoes became a son's. A mother's boots were reshaped for a daughter, and if they didn't fit, you added more moss. Shoes were repaired endlessly. Soles were replaced, uppers were stitched, and cobblers became masters of improvisation. But redesigning the shape, making a left and right, that was too radical. Superstition and symbolism. Shoes weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In some cultures, placing shoes the wrong way invited bad luck. In others, shoes were used in rituals, weddings, and even curses. But despite all the meaning we gave them, we never gave them a left or right. It's strange, isn't it, to think that for centuries we poured time, skill, and symbolism into shoes but never thought to make them foot-specific. We stitched them with care. We decorated them with pride. We wore them with reverence, but we never asked, shouldn't the left foot have its own shoe? The slow march toward change. By the late 1700s, whispers of change began to stir. Some cobblers experimented with curved lasts. Some military outfits began shaping boots for marching efficiency. But it was rare, and often resisted, because symmetry was tradition. And tradition is stubborn. It would take the Industrial Revolution and a few sore-footed soldiers to finally tip the balance. But for now, in the flickering candlelight of a cobbler's shop, shoes remained symmetrical, stitched with love, worn with pain, and accepted without question. Chapter 4. Painful. Elegance, fashion over function. Let's take a slow walk through a ballroom. It's the 1600s. The chandeliers flicker, the music is soft, and the shoes, they're exquisite. Velvet, silk, embroidered with gold thread, but they're also stiff, narrow, and completely symmetrical. Fashion has arrived, and comfort has left the building. In the world of aristocracy, shoes weren't just footwear, they were statements, symbols of wealth, refinement, and social rank. And the more impractical they were, the more impressive. The rise of the pointed toe. Let's start with a plane, a medieval shoe with a toe so long it had to be tied to your leg. Yes, really. In 14th century Europe, nobles wore shoes with elongated tips, sometimes over 20 inches long. The longer the toe, the higher your status. It was a literal foot race of vanity. Walking in them was a challenge, running impossible, but that was the point. If you could afford to wear shoes that made movement difficult, you clearly didn't need to move. Peasants wore practical boots, nobles wore fashion statements, and the divide was visible with every step. Heels entered the scene. By the 1600s, heels had arrived. Not for women, not yet, but for men. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, popularized red heels. They were high, dramatic, and reserved for nobility. Only those with royal permission could wear them. Heels elevated the wearer literally and figuratively. They made legs look longer, posture more regal, and walking more precarious. But, again, comfort wasn't the goal. Elegance was everything. Shoes were narrow, rigid, and symmetrical. The heel added height, but no support, and the arch still ignored. People stuffed their shoes with padding. They wore multiple layers of stockings. They limped through parties with grace and quiet suffering, because fashion demanded it. Women's shoes, beauty and blisters as heels, became popular among men. Women's shoes followed. By the 1700s, women wore delicate slippers with curved heels and pointed toes. Made from satin, brocade, or embroidered silk, they were stunning and completely unforgiving. There was no left or right, just two identical shapes, and if your feet didn't fit, you squeezed. You endured. You smiled through the pain. Shoes were often made to match gowns. They were dyed, decorated, and designed for aesthetics. Function was irrelevant. Some women wore shoes so tight they could barely walk, but they didn't need to. They were carried in carriages, escorted by footmen, and admired from afar. The shoes weren't meant for walking. They were meant for being seen. The shoemakers, shoemakers in this era were artists. They crafted shoes by hand, using fine materials and intricate designs, but they still followed tradition. Symmetry was standard. Even the most luxurious shoes were made without regard for left or right, because that's how it had always been. And changing it would mean rethinking everything from lasts to patterns to stitching techniques. Some shoemakers experimented with curved soles, but they were rare and often dismissed as eccentric. The idea of a left and right shoe was still considered unnecessary. The hidden pain. Let's pause in a dressing room. A noblewoman sits on a velvet stool. Her maid helps her into a corset, then layers of petticoats. Finally, the shoes. They're embroidered, they match the gown, and they pinch. The noblewoman winces but says nothing, because beauty requires sacrifice. She'll wear them all evening. She'll dance, she'll smile, and later, she soak her feet in rosewater and pretend it was worth it. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, a maid slips into worn leather boots. They're patched, they're practical, and they still don't have a left or right, but she doesn't care. She has work to do. status and suffering. In this era, shoes were a visible marker of class. The more impractical, the more elite. If your shoes were delicate, embroidered, and impossible to walk in, you were clearly important. If your shoes were sturdy, patched, and functional, you were clearly not. Fashion created a hierarchy of pain, and everyone played along. Even children wore symmetrical shoes, tiny versions of adult styles. No arch, support, no differentiation. Just two stiff shapes and a lifetime of adaptation. The slow shift. By the late 1700s, whispers of change began to stir. Some military outfits began shaping boots for marching efficiency. Some cobblers experimented with curved lasts. But in the world of fashion, symmetry still reigned. It would take industrialization and a growing middle class to finally shift priorities. Comfort began to matter. Function began to rise, and the idea of a left and right shoe started to feel less radical. But for now, in the flickering candlelight of a ballroom, shoes remained symmetric. Chapter 5. The moss-stuffed shoe. Comfort hacks of the past. Let's talk about desperation. The kind that comes from walking miles in shoes that feel like wooden boxes. Because when your footwear doesn't fit, you get creative. And before the 1800s, creativity was the only option. Shoes were symmetrical. No left, no right. Just a stiff leather shells that vaguely resembled feet. They didn't cradle, they didn't support. They simply existed, so people adapted. They stuffed, they soaked, they suffered quietly, and often with moss between their toes. Moss, nature's and soul. Moss was soft. It was everywhere, and it was free. In medieval Europe, moss was the go-to comfort hack. People gathered it from forests, riverbanks, and stone walls. They dried it, fluffed it, and tucked it into their shoes like a secret cushion. It absorbed sweat. It softened the blow, and it made symmetrical shoes slightly more bearable. But moss had its drawbacks. It held moisture, it grew mold, and after a few days, your shoes smelled like a swamp that had given up. Still, it was better than nothing, and nothing was often the alternative. Wool. The cozy compromise. Wool was another favorite. Thick, warm, and moldable. People wrapped their feet in woolen cloth. They lined their shoes with it. They even stitched wool directly into the soles. In colder climates, wool was essential. It kept frostbite at bay. It cushioned the heel, and it gave your toes a fighting chance. But wool wasn't cheap, and not everyone had access to it, so they improvised. Straw. The crunchy solution. Straw was abundant, dry, lightweight, and surprisingly versatile. People stuffed their shoes with straw like they were packing a scarecrow. It added volume, it absorbed shock, and it made walking slightly less miserable. But straw poked, it shifted, and it made every step sound like a barnyard ballet. Still, it worked. Sort of. And when the straw wore out, you grabbed more. From the stable, from the field, from the roof, if you were desperate. Cloth scraps, the patchwork padding, old shirts, torn linens, frayed curtains, anything soft enough to fold, stuff, and forget. People used cloth scraps to line their shoes. They layered them, they stitched them, they even traded them. Comfort was a currency. In some households, cloth scraps were passed down. A grandmother's apron became a granddaughter's insole. A father's shirt became a son's padding. That it was intimate, resourceful, and oddly poetic. The wet shoe ritual. Now here's a strange one. Some people soaked their shoes in water, then wore them until they dried. Why? Because wet leather molds. It softens, it stretches. By wearing wet shoes, you forced them to conform to your feet. It was uncomfortable, it was soggy, but it worked. Sort of. The process was slow. Your socks got drenched, your feet pruned, your shoes smelled like a medieval sponge. But after a few days, they fit better than before. Not perfectly, but enough. Oils, herbs, and foot potions. Comfort wasn't just about stuffing, it was about preparation. People rubbed their feet with oils, olive, animal fat, even beeswax. It reduced friction, softened skin, and made slipping into stiff shoes slightly easier. Herbs were used to mint, lavender, thyme, not for comfort, for scent, because symmetrical shoes trapped moisture. They bred bacteria, and they made feet fragrant, so people masked the smell. They tucked herbs into their shoes, they sprinkled powders, they prayed. Some cultures used ash or powdered clay to absorb sweat. Others used vinegar to clean the insides. It was a ritual, a negotiation between foot and footwear. Folk remedies and superstition. Shoes weren't just physical, they were symbolic. In some cultures, placing shoes the wrong way invited bad luck. In others, stuffing them with certain herbs warded off evil. Some believed that moss in shoes protected against curses. Others thought wool absorbed negative energy. Shoes were used in rituals, weddings, funerals, even love spells, but despite all the meaning we gave them, we never gave them a left or right. It's strange, isn't it, to think that for centuries, we poured time, skill, and symbolism into shoes, but never thought to make them foot-specific. We stitched them with care, we decorated them with pride, we wore them with reverence, but we never asked, shouldn't the left foot have its own shoe? The cobbler's perspective. Cobblers knew, they saw the blisters, they heard the complaints, but they worked with tradition, with tools passed down, with molds that didn't differentiate. They offered padding, they suggested moss, they nodded sympathetically, but they didn't change the shape. Because change was risky. and symmetry was safe. It would take centuries and a few brave shoemakers to challenge that. The quiet suffering lets pause in a medieval village. A farmer slips on his boots. They're stiff, they're symmetrical, and they're stuffed with straw. He winces. He walks, he doesn't complain because that's life. His wife wears moss-lined slippers. His children wear cloth-wrapped feet. And the cobbler down the road offers no promises, just shoes. Two of them, identical, indifferent. And so, the world walked on, stuffed, soaked, scented, but never truly comfortable until someone finally asked, what if shoes fit? Chapter 6. Military marches and the need for differentiation. Our boots. Not for fashion, not for comfort, but for war. It's the 18th century. The world is shifting. Empires are expanding, and armies are growing fast. Soldiers are marching across continents, through mud, through snow, through blistering heat and bone-chilling cold. And they're doing it in shoes that don't care which foot they're on. Symmetrical boots, stiff leather, flat soles, no arch support, no anatomical curve, just two identical shapes, and a whole lot of pain. The soldier's reality. Imagine being a foot soldier. You wake before dawn. You eat something vaguely edible. You strap on your boots, whichever fits less terribly, and you march 10 miles, 20 miles, sometimes more. Your feet swell, your toes rub raw, your heels blister, but you keep going, because stopping isn't an option. And your boots, they offer no sympathy. They're symmetrical, indifferent, and designed for durability, not comfort. Efficiency over anatomy. Military footwear was built for mass production, for uniformity, for speed. Boots were made in bulk, one shape, one size range, one design. Left and right. Too complicated. Sorting boots by foot orientation slowed down supply chains. It added cost. It required new molds, new training, new thinking, and armies didn't have time for that. So soldiers adapted. They broke in their boots. They stuffed them with wool. They wrapped their feet in cloth and they limped. Quietly, collectively, relentlessly. The medical consequences. Military doctors began to notice. Foot injuries were rampant. Blisters turned into infections. Sprains became chronic pain. Marching efficiency dropped. Some soldiers developed trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsupportive footwear. Others suffered from collapsed arches, misaligned joints, and lifelong mobility issues. The boots were doing damage, and the damage was costing lives. Reports began to circulate, letters from the front lines, medical journals, whispers in barracks. Something had to change. The first experiments in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Some military units began experimenting. Boots shaped for the left and right foot, curved soles, raised arches, heel counters for stability. It was radical, unorthodox, and surprisingly effective. Soldiers marched farther, recovered faster, complained less. The boots fit better. They wore evenly. They reduced injury. And slowly the idea spread. The American shift. In the United States, the War Department began issuing left-right boots for cavalry units. Mounted soldiers needed stability, precision, balance. Symmetrical boots didn't cut it. So they adopted anatomical designs. And the results were clear. Better posture, fewer falls, improved performance. Other branches took notice. Infantry units began requesting similar footwear, and shoemakers responded. Left and right boots became more common. Not universal, but no longer rare. European adoption. In Europe, change was slower. Tradition ran deep. Symmetry was sacred, but necessity is persuasive. French regiments began testing curved lasts. British units experimented with arch support. German shoemakers introduced anatomical molds. The results echoed across the continent. Soldiers moved better, fought longer, recovered faster, and the old ways began to crack. The shoemaker's role, military shoemakers, often called cordwainers, played a crucial role. They studied feet, measured soldiers, tracked wear patterns. They noticed that symmetrical boots wore unevenly. The left boot bent differently than the right. The soles wore out in opposite directions. It was evidence, proof that feet weren't interchangeable. So they adapted. They carved new lasts. They stitched new patterns. They trained apprentices in anatomical design. And they changed history, one boot at a time. Logistics and resistance. Not everyone embraced the change. Quartermasters resisted. Left-right boots required sorting, labeling, inventory tracking. It was a logistical headache. Some officers dismissed the idea as unnecessary. They believed discipline could overcome discomfort, that a good soldier didn't need good shoes. But the data said otherwise, and slowly resistance faded. The science of marching. Researchers began studying gait, how feet move, how pressure distributes, how shoes affect posture. They discovered that symmetrical boots caused imbalance. They forced the body to compensate. They increased fatigue. Anatomical boots, by contrast, improved alignment, reduced strain, enhanced endurance. It was science. And science doesn't care about tradition. The human cost. Let's pause in a muddy field. A young soldier sits on a log. His boots are soaked. His feet are blistered. His socks are stained with blood. He unwraps his foot, winces, and reaches for a scrap of wool. He's marched 30 miles. He's slept in a ditch. And his boots, symmetrical, stiff, unforgiving, have betrayed him. He dreams of comfort, of shoes that fit. of a future where his feet aren't a battlefield, and somewhere, in a workshop far away, a shoemaker is carving a curved last. Change is coming. The march toward modernity by the mid-1800s. Left-right boots were standard in many armies, not everywhere, not always, but increasingly common. The military had led the way, out of necessity, out of compassion, out of sheer practicality. And civilians followed. Shoemakers adopted anatomical designs, factories standardized molds, stores offered left-right pairs. The symmetrical boot became a relic, a museum piece, a reminder of a time when pain was part of the uniform, and the soldier's march, once blistered and broken, became smoother, stronger, more humane. Chapter 7. The Industrial Revolution and the Rise of the Left Shoe. Let's step into a factory. It's loud, it smells like leather, oil, and ambition, and it's about to change everything. The year is somewhere in the early 1800s. Steam engines hiss, gears grind, and shoemaking, once the quiet craft of cobblers, is becoming a booming industry. For centuries, shoes were handmade, slowly, patiently, symmetrically, but now machines are here, and they're not interested in tradition. From cobbler to conveyor belt before the Industrial Revolution, shoemaking was personal. A cobbler knew your feet. He stitched your shoes by hand. He offered moss, wool, and quiet sympathy. But he didn't offer left and right because that required extra work, extra molds, extra thought. And tradition said, why bother? But machines don't care about tradition. They care about efficiency. Factories began producing shoes in bulk, hundreds, thousands, identical shapes, stamped out like cookies. At first they followed the old ways, symmetrical shoes, one size fits most, fast, cheap, and familiar. But then, something strange happened. People started complaining. The rise of the foot. With mass production came mass discomfort. Symmetrical shoes didn't fit. They rubbed, they blistered. And now, people had options. They could compare, they could return, they could demand better. Shoemakers took notice. So did engineers. And slowly, the foot became a subject of study. They measured arches, mapped pressure points, analyzed gait, and they discovered something shocking. Feet are different left and right. High arches, flat soles, wide toes, narrow heels. It was a revelation. And it changed everything. The birth of the last in shoemaking. A last is a mold, a foot-shaped block used to shape the shoe. Before industrialization, lasts were generic, one shape used for both feet. But now, factories needed precision, consistency, anatomical accuracy. So they created left and right lasts, curved soles, raised arches, heel counters. Shoes began to resemble feet, not just vaguely, but intentionally. It was revolutionary, quietly, and it gave birth to the modern shoe. The department store experience. With industrialization came retail, department stores, catalogs, shopping as an event. People tried on shoes before buying. They walked around, judged fit, and symmetrical shoes didn't pass the test. Left-right shoes became standard, not just for soldiers, but for everyone. Children's shoes were shaped for growth. Women's shoes balanced fashion and function. Men's shoes offered support and durability. The shoemaking industry exploded, and the symmetrical shoe became a relic. The science of comfort researchers joined the party. Podiatrists, orthopedists, ergonomists. They studied how shoes affect posture, how pressure distributes, how design impacts health. They found that symmetrical shoes caused imbalance. They forced the body to compensate. They increased fatigue. Anatomical shoes, by contrast, improved alignment, reduced strain, enhanced endurance. It was science. And science doesn't care about nostalgia. The shoemaker's evolution. Traditional cobblers adapted. They learned new techniques, used new tools, trained in anatomical design. Some resisted. They missed the simplicity, the symmetry, the quiet rhythm of old shoemaking. But most embraced the change because it made sense. And it made shoes better. Left and right shoes weren't just practical, they were humane. The traveler's tale. Let's pause in a train station. A man laces up his boots. They're new, they're curved, they fit. He walks with ease, no blisters, no limp. He's headed to the city, to work, to live, and his shoes shaped for each foot carry him forward. It's a small detail, but it changes everything. Hygiene and health. Industrialization also brought hygiene, cleaner factories, better materials, sanitation standards. Shoes became safer, less likely to cause infection, more likely to support health. Left-right design helped. It reduced friction, improved circulation, protected joints. And people noticed they walked more, stood longer, lived better, all because their shoes fit. Fashion meets function. Even fashion adapted. Designers embraced anatomical shapes. They added style, color, flair, but they kept the curve, the arch, the left and right, because beauty without comfort is just punishment, and people wanted both. The quiet revolution. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't dramatic, but it was profound. The Industrial Revolution gave us machines, mass production, efficiency, but it also gave us empathy for feet, for comfort, for the quiet suffering we'd accepted for centuries, and it gave us the left shoe and the right. Two distinct shapes, two distinct roles, working together. Chapter 8. Victorian Footwear Etiquette. style, and suffering. Let's step into a drawing room. It's the mid-1800s. The wallpaper is floral, the furniture is velvet, and the shoes, they're exquisite, delicate boots, buttoned slippers, embroidered heels, all designed to impress and to pinch. Welcome to the Victorian era where etiquette ruled, fashion flourished, and comfort was politely ignored. The rise of the button boot. Victorian women wore button boots, tall, narrow, and impossibly elegant, made from leather, satin, or kidskin, fastened with tiny buttons that required a special hook to close. They hugged the ankle, shaped the calf, and made walking a performance, but they weren't easy to wear. The fit was tight, the soles were stiff, and the heels, though modest, were enough to throw off your balance. Still, they were beautiful, and beauty was everything. Women sat for hours while maids buttoned their boots. They stood gracefully, they walked slowly, and they smiled through the pain because that was etiquette. Men's shoes, polished and punishing. Victorian men had their own footwear rituals. They wore polished leather shoes, often black, always formal. The soles were thick, the uppers were stiff, and the shape, though now left and right, was still unforgiving. Men's shoes were designed for posture, for presence, for power. They weren't meant for comfort. They were meant to signal status. A well-dressed man had shiny shoes, straight laces, and a quiet limp he never acknowledged, because acknowledging discomfort was impolite. The shoemakers challenged. Shoemakers in the Victorian era were artists. They crafted shoes by hand, measured feet, selected materials, but they also followed fashion. And fashion demanded narrow toes, high vamps, and silhouettes that defied anatomy. Even with left and right molds, the designs were restrictive. Shoes were made to look good, not to feel good. Some shoemakers tried to balance both. They added padding, used softer leather, experimented with flexible soles, but they were the exception, not the rule, because the rule was elegance, at any cost. The etiquette of footwear. Victorian society had rules for everything. How to sit, how to stand, how to cross your ankles. Shoes were part of the performance. Women were expected to wear boots indoors, slippers for evening, heels for formal events. Men changed shoes for dinner, for walking, for riding, and children were trained early to lace, to polish, to endure. Shoes were cleaned daily, stored in velvet-lined boxes, and never discussed in terms of comfort, because comfort was private, and shoes were public. The rituals of relief behind closed doors. Victorians sought relief. They soaked their feet in rosewater, applied balms and oils, wrapped blisters in silk. Some used foot powders, others wore padded stockings, and a few brave souls requested custom shoes, but it was all done quietly, discreetly, with the same elegance as the pain itself, because suffering was part of the aesthetic. And shoes were the silent accomplice. Travel and terrain. Victorian shoes weren't built for adventure. They struggled on cobblestones, slipped on wet grass, sank in mud, but people traveled anyway. They packed extra shoes, walking boots, riding boots, even bathing shoes, each with its own purpose, its own discomfort, its own charm, and they accepted the limitations, because fashion had rules, and rules were sacred. Hygiene and health. Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness. They bathed, they powdered, they perfumed, but shoes were tricky. They trapped moisture, bred bacteria, and caused foot ailments. Doctors warned against tight shoes, recommended foot exercises, prescribed ointments, but society didn't listen. Because tight shoes looked better, and looking better mattered more. Still, change was coming, slowly, quietly. The shift toward comfort. By the late 1800s, whispers of comfort began to stir. Rubber soles appeared, elastic gussets made boots easier to wear, softer leathers gained popularity. Shoemakers experimented, designers adapted, and consumers responded. Left and right shoes were now standard, and comfort, once taboo, became desirable. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to matter. The Victorian legacy. Let's pause in a parlor. A woman removes her boots. Her feet are red, her ankles sore. She sighs, applies balm, and prepares for tomorrow, because tomorrow brings another outfit, another pair of shoes, another day of elegant suffering, and she endured gracefully, quietly, because that's what Victorians did. They walked in beauty, they limped in silence, and they paved the way for change. One buttoned boot at a time. Chapter 9. Global Footprints. How Cultures Approached Shoes. 1,500 plus words. Immersive, gently humorous, and narration ready. Let's take a slow walk around the world. Not in sneakers, not in boots, but in the shoes of history, woven, carved, stitched, and sometimes improvised. Because while the West was busy stuffing moss into symmetrical leather shells, other cultures had their own ideas. Ideas shaped by climate, by terrain, by tradition. And yet, across continents and centuries, one thing remained curiously consistent. Shoes didn't care which foot they were on. Japan, the art of the split toe in. Japan, the art of the split toe in Japan. Footwear was minimalist, elegant, functional. The getter, a wooden sandal raised on 2 blocks, was worn with tabi, split toe socks that separated the big toe from the rest. It was a subtle nod to anatomy. But the getter itself, perfectly symmetrical. Then came the zori flat sandals made from straw or lacquered wood. worn by samurai, merchants, and monks alike. Again, no left or right. Even the waraji rope sandals used by travelers and soldiers were interchangeable, tied to the foot, shaped by wear, but not by design. Japanese footwear was deeply symbolic. Shoes were removed before entering homes, placed neatly, respectfully, but they weren't shaped for comfort. They were shaped for culture. India, the paduka and the path in India. The paduka reigned for centuries, a wooden sole with a single-toe knob, no straps, no laces, just balance and grace, worn by sages, monks, and royalty. The paduka was more than a shoe, it was a statement, and it was symmetrical. Left and right didn't matter. What mattered was posture, poise, spiritual alignment. In rural areas, people went barefoot or wore simple leather sandals. Soft, flexible, still symmetrical. Footwear was often handmade, passed down, blessed, and while comfort was considered, it was never the priority. China, cloth shoes and cultural steps. In ancient China, shoes were soft, made from cloth, silk or cotton, embroidered with dragons, flowers, and symbols of luck. They were worn indoors, outdoors, at court, in fields, and they were symmetrical. Even the ornate shoes worn by nobility with curved tips and delicate stitching didn't distinguish left from right. Then came the controversial practice of foot binding, a painful tradition that reshaped the foot to fit tiny lotus-shaped shoes. These shoes were anatomical in a tragic way. They fit the foot precisely. Because the foot had been forced to fit them, it was a reminder that shoes can shape culture, and culture can shape shoes. But outside of that practice, most Chinese footwear remained interchangeable, comfortable, beautiful, and indifferent. Africa, sandals, leather, and ingenuity crossed Africa. Footwear was shaped by terrain in desert regions. Sandals protected against heat, made from leather, tire, rubber, or woven fibers. Simple, durable, and symmetrical. In forested areas, shoes were rare. Feet were tough, calloused, adapted. But when shoes were worn, they were practical, crafted from local materials, designed for movement, not for fashion. Some cultures used animal hides, others used bark, reeds, or cloth. Footwear was often ceremonial, worn for dances, rites of passage, spiritual rituals, and while some designs hinted at left-right shaping, most remained universal because the foot would adapt, and the shoe would follow. Indigenous Americas, moccasins, and meaning in North America. Indigenous tribes wore moccasins, soft leather shoes stitched from deer, elk, or buffalo hide, flexible, quiet, perfect for hunting and walking. Some moccasins were foot-shaped, curved, tailored, others were symmetrical, made quickly, worn interchangeably, designs varied by tribe. The Plains tribes favored hard soles for rocky terrain. Eastern tribes used soft soles for forest floors. Moccasins were decorated, beaded, painted, infused with meaning. They told stories, marked status, honored ancestors, and while some were made left-right, many were not, because the moccasin molded to the foot and the foot molded to the land. Europe beyond the West, slippers and simplicity. In Eastern Europe, shoes were often handmade, wool slippers, leather boots, felted clogs, valanki thick felt boots kept feet warm in brutal winters. They were symmetrical, but worn with care. In the Balkans, or Pansy, traditional leather shoes with curled toes were tied to the foot, flexible, durable, and interchangeable. Footwear was shaped by need, by weather, by work. And while left-right shoes existed, they weren't common because survival mattered more than symmetry. The Islamic world, sandals and spirituality. In the Islamic world, shoes were removed before prayer. Cleanliness was sacred, respect was paramount. Footwear ranged from simple sandals to ornate slippers, often made from leather, often symmetrical. In Persia, shoes were embroidered. In the Ottoman Empire, they were curled and colorful, but they weren't shaped for left and right. They were shaped for tradition, and tradition was powerful. Trade, travel, and transformation. As trade routes expanded, so did footwear. Silk Road merchants wore sturdy boots. Pilgrims wore sandals. Explorers wore whatever they could find. Shoes were exchanged, adapted, merged. Cultures borrowed designs, improvised materials, and shared techniques. But symmetry remained. Why symmetry persisted across cultures? Symmetry made sense. It simplified production, reduced cost, allowed for reuse. Shoes could be passed down, swapped, repaired, and in many places, shoes were optional. Feet were strong, resilient, trusted. So the shoe didn't need to fit perfectly. It just needed to protect. And protection was universal. A global pause. Let's pause. In a quiet village, a child runs barefoot. A grandmother stitches a sandal. A traveler adjusts his moccasin. None of them think about left or right. They think about movement, about meaning, about the path ahead, and their shoes, simple, symbolic, and symmetrical, carry them forward. Because around the world for most of history, shoes didn't care which foot they were on, and somehow that worked until it didn't. Chapter 10. The Psychology of Symmetry. Why we didn't mind. Approximately 1,500 plus words, immersive, gently humorous, and narration ready. Let's begin with a question. Why did we walk in symmetrical shoes for thousands of years and barely complain? Why did we accept blisters, calluses, and the quiet rebellion of our feet without protest? The answer isn't just historical, it's psychological, because symmetry, for most of human history, felt right even when it wasn't. Symmetry is comforting. Humans love symmetry. We see it in nature, in faces, in architecture, in art. Symmetry feels balanced, predictable, safe. It's why we find butterflies beautiful, why we admire cathedrals, why we feel uneasy when a picture frame is crooked. Symmetry gives us a sense of control, of order, of calm. And when it came to shoes, that same instinct applied. Two identical shapes, two matching soles, a pair that looked neat, tidy, and complete, even if our feet disagreed. The brain's blind spot. Our brains are masters of adaptation. They ignore discomfort. They normalize pain. They convince us that it's not that bad, especially when everyone else is doing it. If your neighbor is limping in symmetrical boots, if your grandmother wore moss-stuffed slippers, if your cobbler insists this is how it's done, you believe it because the brain values social proof, tradition, consensus. And symmetrical shoes had all three. So we didn't question, we didn't rebel, we simply walked awkwardly but obediently. The power of habit. Habits are powerful. They shape behavior. They resist change. And symmetrical shoes were a habit. For centuries, shoemakers used the same molds, the same patterns, the same logic. Parents taught children, masters taught apprentices, culture taught everyone. And once a habit is formed, it becomes invisible. We didn't think about left and right because we never had to. The shoe was a shoe, and that was enough. The role of expectations. Expectations shape experience. If you expect shoes to hurt, you tolerate the pain. If you expect blisters, you bring wool. If you expect discomfort, you don't complain. And for most of history, shoes were tools, not luxuries, not expressions, just protection. So we didn't expect comfort, and we didn't miss what we'd never known. It's like sleeping on straw. If that's all you've ever had, you don't dream of memory foam until someone shows you cultural acceptance of discomfort. In many cultures, discomfort was noble, a sign of discipline, of humility, of strength. Shoes that pinched, proof of refinement. Boots that blistered, evidence of hard work. Slippers that slipped, a reminder to walk slowly. Discomfort was woven into identity, into ritual, into fashion. And challenging that discomfort felt disrespectful, so we didn't. We endured, elegantly, collectively. The shoemakers' authorities. Shoemakers were respected, trusted, sometimes feared. They knew leather, they knew feet, they knew tradition, and they insisted symmetrical shoes. Our standard customers rarely argued, because the cobbler had the tools, the knowledge, the legacy. And legacy is persuasive, even if it's wrong. The practicality of symmetry. Symmetrical shoes were practical. They simplified production, reduced cost, allowed for reuse. You could swap shoes, pass them down, repair them easily. Shoes required precision, measurement, customization. And for most people that wasn't feasible, so symmetry wasn't just tradition. It was survival. The fear of change. Change is scary. It challenges norms. It creates uncertainty. And left-right shoes were a change. They required new molds, new training, new thinking. Some feared they wouldn't sell. Others feared they wouldn't last. And fear is sticky. It clings to habits, to beliefs, to souls. So we stayed symmetrical, because it was safer. The moment of realization. But then something shifted. People tried on left-right shoes. They walked, they smiled, and they realized, this feels better. The brain adjusted, expectations changed, habits broke, and suddenly, symmetry felt wrong. It was a quiet revolution, 1 foot at a time. The psychology of relief. Let's pause in a shoe store. A woman tries on a curved shoe. It hugs her arch, supports her heel, respects her toes. She walks, she breathes, buys. Not because it's fashionable, but because it fits. And her brain, once loyal to symmetry, celebrates a shift because comfort, once discovered, is hard to forget. The modern mindset today, we expect comfort, we demand it. Shoes must fit, support, adapt. We have orthotics, ergonomic soles, custom molds. And symmetry, it's reserved for art, not for feet. We've reprogrammed our brains, redefined our habits, rewritten our expectations. And it all began with a question: what if shoes fit? Chapter 11. The Quiet Revolution. Ergonomics and foot science. Approximately 1,500 plus words, immersive, gently humorous, and narration ready. Let's begin in a lab, not a cobbler's shop, not a fashion house, but a quiet room filled with charts, pressure, maps, and foot molds, because the revolution in footwear didn't begin with style. It began with science. And it was quiet, precise, patient. A revolution of arches, of angles, of anatomy. The rise of foot science in the early 20th century. Doctors began studying feet, not just bones and muscles, but movement, pressure, posture. Asked questions cobblers never did. How does the foot absorb shock? How does gait affect the spine? What happens when shoes don't fit? They used X-rays, pressure plates, motion capture, and they discovered something radical. Feet are complex. They flex, they rotate, they adapt. And symmetrical shoes don't. The anatomy of a step walking is a miracle. A symphony of joints, muscles, and balance. The heel strikes, the arch compresses, the toes push off. Each foot plays its part differently, delicately dotted. When shoes ignore that choreography, the body suffers. Doctors documented misalignments, back pain, knee strain, hip issues, all traced back to the foot. And the shoe, it was a revelation, and it demanded change. The birth of ergonomics. Ergonomics is the science of design for humans that asks, how do we sit, stand, move, and how can tools like shoes support that movement? Ergonomists studied foot shape, arch height, toe spread. They created models, simulations, design principles, and they applied them to footwear. The result? Shoes that fit, that support, that care. It was quiet, but profound. The orthotic revolution. Orthotics changed everything. Custom insoles, arch support, heel cups, designed to correct posture, relieve pain, enhance movement. Doctors prescribed them. Patients embraced them. Shoemakers adapted. Orthotics made left-right shoes essential, because each foot needed its own solution, and symmetry was no longer acceptable. The role of research. Universities joined the movement. Biomechanics labs studied runners. Podiatry schools trained specialists. Design schools collaborated with engineers. They tested materials, measured impact, mapped pressure, and they published findings. Shoes affect health. Comfort affects productivity. Fit affects everything. It was data, and data doesn't lie. The designers' response. Designers listened. They created shoes for walking, for standing, or dancing. They used memory foam, gel inserts, shock absorbers. They shaped soles to match gait. They curved uppers to hug the foot, and they made left-right shoes the default, not just for athletes, but for everyone. The wellness connection. Footwear became part of wellness. Yoga instructors recommended flexible soles. Physical therapists prescribed supportive shoes. Workplace ergonomics included proper footwear. Shoes were no longer accessories. They were tools, partners in health. And people noticed they walked more, stood longer, felt better, all because their shoes fit. The travel test. Let's pause. In an airport, a traveler walks briskly. Her shoes are curved, cushioned, supportive. She's been on her feet for hours, but she's smiling because her shoes respect her feet. Her movement, her journey in that respect is revolutionary. Hygiene and sustainability. Science also improved hygiene. Antimicrobial insoles, breathable fabrics, moisture-wicking linings. Shoes became cleaner, healthier, smarter, and sustainability joined the conversation. Designers used recycled materials, biodegradable soles, ethical production. Because science isn't just about comfort, it's about conscience. The psychology of fit. Researchers studied psychology too. They found that comfortable shoes improve mood, reduce stress, boost confidence, that proper fit enhances focus, that pain distracts, and that shoes humble. Quiet shoes shape experience. It was a reminder design matters, details matter, feet matter. The quiet revolution. Let's pause. In a lab again, a researcher adjusts a pressure sensor. A volunteer walks across a mat. Data appears colorful, precise, beautiful. That tells a story of movement, of balance, of care, and that story becomes a shoe, a left shoe, a right shoe. Two shapes to rolls, one revolution. Chapter 12. Modern shoes. From orthopedics to Crocs. Approximately 1,500 words. Immersive, gently humorous, and narration ready. Let's open your closet. Not the one with coats, the one with shoes. There's a pair for running, a pair for walking, a pair you haven't worn in years but refuse to throw away. There are boots, slippers, sandals, sneakers, and every single one has a left and a right. We've come a long way. From moss-stuffed leather shells to memory foam insoles, from stiff, symmetrical torture devices to ergonomic, arch-hugging companions. Welcome to the modern age of footwear, where shoes are smart, stylish, and sometimes a little strange. The orthopedic renaissance. Let's start with the serious stuff. Orthopedic shoes used to be clunky, heavy, unfashionable. They were the footwear equivalent of a medical chart, necessary but not admired. But today, they're sleek, supportive, designed with care. Orthopedic shoes now come in styles that rival designer brands. They feature gel inserts, shock-absorbing soles, custom arch support. They're prescribed by podiatrists, recommended by physical therapists, worn by people who value comfort and don't want to sacrifice style. And they're always left-right because precision matters. Athletic shoes, performance meets personality. Right? Shoes are a science experiment. Every brand has its own philosophy, its own foam, its own curve. Some shoes propel you forward, others cushion your landing, some do both. They're designed for pronation, supination, neutral gait. They come in widths, arch types, heel drops, and they're tested in labs, on tracks, in marathons. Athletes demand performance, and shoes deliver. Left and right. Shoes are shaped differently because your feet are shaped differently, and every step counts. Fashion footwear, beauty and balance. Fashion, who hasn't forgotten its roots? It still flirts with discomfort, but it's learning. Heels are now engineered, platforms are padded, flats are flexible. Designers collaborate with podiatrists, they study pressure points, they test materials, and while some shoes still prioritize aesthetics, most try to balance it with function because consumers are smarter. They want beauty, but they also want to walk, and walking requires respect for the foot, casual comfort. The rise of the everyday shoe. Let's talk about the shoes you actually wear: slip-ons, sneakers, foam clogs. They're everywhere, on sidewalks, in airports, at grocery stores. They're designed for ease, for comfort, for real life. Brands like Skechers, Allbirds, and Hoka have built empires on softness, on support, on the promise that your feet won't hate you. These shoes are lightweight, breathable, and shaped for each foot because even casual shoes take anatomy seriously. Slippers and house shoes, cozy by design at home. We want warmth, softness, peace. Slippers used to be flat, flimsy, forgettable. Now they're engineered with memory foam, arch support, non-slip soles. They cradle your feet, respect your stride, and make you feel hugged. Left and right slippers are standard because even relaxation deserves precision. Hygiene and materials. Modern shoes are clean. They use antimicrobial linings, moisture-wicking fabrics, odor-resistant insoles. They breathe, they adapt, they protect, and they're made from everything: recycled plastic, organic cotton, plant-based foam. Sustainability is in, and shoes are leading the way. Brands use vegan leather, biodegradable soles, ethical labor, because comfort isn't just physical, it's moral. Travel and versatility. Modern shoes travel. Well, they're foldable, packable, multi-purpose. One pair can take you from airport to hike to dinner. They're designed for movement, for unpredictability, for life, and they're shaped for each foot because adventure requires balance. Smart shoes. Technology meets Toesius. Smart shoes exist. They track steps, monitor posture, adjust cushioning. Some connect to apps, some charge wirelessly, some even warm your feet. It's futuristic, it's niche, but it's happening, and it's always anatomical because data demands accuracy. Crocs, the foam phenomenon. Let's talk about Crocs foam clogs with holes. Loved, hated, worn by chefs, nurses, and toddlers. They're lightweight, waterproof, surprisingly supportive, and they have left and right shapes because even the quirkiest shoes respect the basics. Crocs are a reminder that comfort wins, that weird can work, that feet deserve kindness. Barefoot shoes. Minimalism with purpose. Some shoes go the other way. Barefoot shoes mimic being barefoot. Thin soles, wide toe boxes, zero drop. They're designed to strengthen feet, improve posture, reconnect with natural movement. They're controversial but growing, and they're always left because minimalism doesn't mean neglect. The modern footprint. Let's pause in a shoe store. A child tries on sneakers. They fit, they support, they sparkle. Her feet are respected, her movement is honored, her future is shaped, and her shoes, curved, cushioned, caring, are part of that journey. We've come a long way, from symmetrical suffering to ergonomic empathy, from moss to memory foam, from indifference to innovation. And every step forward has been shaped by the left shoe and the right. Outroa. Sleepy farewell to the age of identical soles. Approximately 1,500 words. Immersive, gently humorous, and narration ready. Let's take off our shoes, not because they hurt, not because they're symmetrical, but because the story is ending. We've walked through centuries, across continents, through cobbler shops, battlefields, ballrooms, and factories. We've stepped in moss, marched in boots, danced in slippers, and now we rest because the age of identical soles is behind us. A journey remembered. It began with sandals, flat, simple, unapologetically symmetrical. Egyptians walked in leather soles, Greeks tied cords around their feet, Romans clanked in hobnailed boots. None of them cared about left or right. They cared about protection, about status, about tradition. Then came the turn shoe, stitched inside out, flipped like a pancake. Still symmetrical. Medieval peasants stuffed their shoes with straw. Nobles wore pointed toes tied to their knees. Comfort was a rumor. In shoes, they watched silently, indifferently. The first steps toward change. Soldiers marched, blistered, collapsed. Doctors noticed. Shoemakers experimented. Boots began to curve. Left and right shoes appeared quietly, in barracks, in workshops, in whispers. Then came machines. Steam, steel, precision. Factories molded shoes to match feet. Stores offered sizes. People tried them on. And the revolution began. The science of fit. Researchers studied gait, mapped pressure, measured arches. They discovered that feet are complex, that shoes affect posture, that comfort matters. Designers listened. Engineers collaborated. Shoes evolved. Orthotics supported. Ergonomics guided. Fashion adapted. And the left shoe finally knew its place. The modern footprint today. Shoes are everywhere. Smart, stylish, supportive. We have sneakers that track steps, slippers that hug arches, foam clogs that defy logic. We have shoes for hiking, for dancing, for lounging. And every single one has a left and a right because we've learned, we've grown, we've walked far. The philosophy of footwear. Shoes are more than tools. They're companions. They shape experience. They reflect identity. They tell stories of movement, of culture, of care, and they remind us, progress is quiet. Comfort is earned. Symmetry isn't always the answer. A tribute to the cobbler. Let's pause in a quiet shop. A cobbler wipes his hands. He stitched thousands of shoes. He's watched styles change. He's felt the shift. He remembers the symmetrical days, the moss, the wool, the silent suffering, and he smiles, because now his shoes fit, they curve, they support, they care, and his legacy has evolved. A thank you to the footlets, thank our feet, for adapting, for enduring, for walking through history. They've bent, blistered, balanced, they've carried us, lifted us, grounded us, and now they're honored with shoes that listen, that learn, that love. A gentle goodbye. So tonight, as you slip off your shoes, feel the curve, the arch, the quiet respect. Remember the journey, from flat sandals to orthopedic marvels, from indifference to empathy. And know that every step you take is shaped by centuries, by stories, by souls. Left and right, together finally. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be soft, your steps be gentle, and your shoes always know which way to go. If you liked this video, kindly subscribe this channel.